We're gonna share a paper that this group of us in Metagov has been working on for a while now. The three of us, me, Nathan, Ronen, and Zargham, will present, but I also just want to acknowledge that our fourth co-author, Kelsey Nabin, is just not here because of time zone issues, but she's very much here in spirit and in her intellectual contributions to the work that we're sharing. Please imagine her into this space. The problem we're taking on is, in some sense, a profoundly real problem, and in some sense, a kind of speculative problem. The speculative side of it is what happens if we win, which is to say, what happens if we get governable democratic inputs into our online lives everywhere we go? Doesn't that sound tremendously overwhelming? What would it mean if the daycare you dropped your kids off at, the neighborhood you live in, and the workplace you work in, and the social networks that you're interacting with, and the online retailer that you're working with are all in some way co-governed by their participants, by you? Isn't that, in some sense, tremendously overwhelming? In many respects, this is something that has already come up as a problem for people trying to build self-governing online spaces. Many of the early experiments with DAOs and blockchains encountered this question of what is the attention economy for governance? And we found that this question hasn't really been taken up in a serious way and theorized. It's something I've experienced both offline with cooperative businesses trying to figure out what should we expect of our members, what should we expect of each other, as well as the kind of online experiments that many of us have been part of. This paper is an attempt to contribute to this challenge. Ronen, do you want to take it away?
So we started off from this point of attention economies and how it's been theorized in the earlier days. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Herbert Simon's kind of seminal work on this. In an information-rich world, the wealth of information means a dearth of something else, a scarcity of whatever it is that information consumes, that's attention. And Herbert Simon is operating in this kind of 1970s bureaucratic firms, imagining, people that have to kind of process information somewhat like computers. If they have a lot of information to process, that is going to consume all their attention and they won't have time to do other things. So it's simplistic but very powerful framing that is still relevant. But I think we felt we were going up against the limits of this. Yes, attention can be scarce in certain settings, especially the settings that Herbert Simon is imagining, but it can also be abundant in many other ways. The attention economy metaphor just doesn't always work, and it obscures things as well as helps us explain things. So one place where we felt like we were moving beyond the traditional attention economy framing is when we started looking at the commons literature. One of the prompts for me for this paper was reading a lot about Elinor Ostrom and Yochai Benkler, who are two central theorists of the commons. And when you read their work, you can see that you have Herbert Simon telling us that attention is a resource and there's economies of attention. But on the other hand, we have these kind of new ideas around how to govern new kinds of economies, like commons, as opposed to the kind of traditional. Elinor Ostrom has a lot of ideas of how commons can be self-governing and how it isn't all just a tragedy. And so she takes us away from some of the scarcity mindset. But at the same time, we were also seeing that they don't really reckon with attention as a limiting factor. So it's kind of trying to bring in some of the new thinking about commons, new economic thinking of commons, but also squaring it with attention. Elinor Ostrom was mostly operating in pre-online community days. Yochai Benkler was quite sharp about seeing a lot of the things that came up with attention. He did talk about attention in his work, but neither of them looked at the idea of people participating in many spaces of governance, participating in many commons at the same time and having to manage that. Attention and governance is not something that they focused on because it wasn't really a problem in the spaces they were thinking about. So in practice, we have this kind of information overload. In the context of governance, we started calling it governance overload. You're participating in many spaces. You don't really have time to get acquainted with all the proposals that are being submitted, all the context that you need to make effective decisions. And what do we do about this? This is the context for us coming into this work where we're looking at these new online communities that are proliferating, and we really don't have the theories or practical design considerations to help us, create self-governing online communities in ways that really respect and preserve human attention.
One of the ways that we approach this methodologically, you could think of this as a mapping of information and decision flow. This diagram identifies the action arena, terminology taken from the commons literature. This is the environment in which humans are making choices about what to spend their attention and effort on. They have to make a choice between, for example, participation in governance versus taking first order activities within that organization or participating in other environments. And given what Ronen and Nathan just laid out, we're observing that some of that choice is which governance environment to even participate in. Then you have multiple mechanisms through which you might participate. That could be discussions on forums, that could be explicit voting mechanisms, it could be any number of activities that could be thought of as means of affecting the organization's trajectory of governing or steering it. And those activities are aggregated across multiple participants, often with different interests, preferences, and choices of modality. Changes within that system result in some kind of outcomes. And it's worth noting that those outcomes are both on the system itself, so back around on those same people. It changes the structure, shape, or the lived experience in the action arena. There are also effects on other stakeholders. So it's not only that we have many different landscapes in which to participate in governance in our modern multi-landscape that Nathan described at the beginning, they're coupled with each other. And we're making individual choices about which action arenas to participate in, how to participate in them, and ultimately those choices and activities feed back on those same action arenas. The idea is that these are not only closed loops, but they're plural in their site. Many individual participants are forced to choose between which landscapes and which modalities they participate in. This means that even though we have a generative, and again, this is the balance between these two theories, a generative, hey, lots of people, lots of attention available, it's abundant, we can crowdsource this attention to create more than we would be able to without this diverse collection of participants. Individuals are forced to choose how much time and effort to put into learning context, how deep to go into a particular governance modality, or even whether they want to participate in governance and org level steering versus just participate or consume the thing that's being governed. To Nathan's point earlier, that's the case in a lot of people's lives. For me, I'm happy to participate in governance of a few things, but most things I have to trust that someone is doing that because I rely on their choices. I can only participate in governance for so many things. We can go to the next slide. This is probably Nathan territory.
Yeah, this points to something Ronen spoke about earlier, which is the question about scarcity and abundance. One point that we turn to is the legacy of feminist economic thought around platforms, recognizing that often there are forms of labor in platform economies and other economies that are invisibilized. And sometimes attention plays that role. So we need to be attentive to ways in which attention is being asked of people in ways that we're not recognizing and that we're not supporting. Recognizing that, for instance, attention can be a form of labor, that governance is a form of labor, and that it not only needs to be noticed, but also provisioned for. Okay. So the empirical heart of this project is a series of case studies in the context of Web3, primarily because this is a space where attention and governance really first became a problem. Most online spaces don't offer a lot of opportunities for participants to do self-governance. I wrote a book about this. It's often not available in our online spaces, but in the context of blockchains and Web3 projects, the idea that participants would be co-governing their infrastructures raised this problem in a particularly acute way, and where a lot of early projects and ongoing projects in this ecosystem have been trying to contend with attention. We look at three different approaches, three different contexts where this has been happening. And these are things that we've mainly kind of participated in or experienced directly. So these are kind of fairly informal but grounded case studies. Ronen, do you want to say a bit about DAOstack, which is the first?
Sure. So yeah, we have DAOstack was one of the case studies we looked at. I was a researcher for DAOstack for about a year in 2021, so I had firsthand experience with some of the events we were looking at, even though some of it also happened before my time there. DAOstack was behind one of the first DAOs, the Genesis DAO, and they were building kind of the technical infrastructure, the stack, the tech stack for running DAOs. They identified the effective management of human attention is a key challenge to be addressing. And they called it the decentralized governance scalability problem. You can't scale up governance if you're not handling this idea of scale. As more people join, there'll be more proposals, and there needs to be some way to prioritize, rank, and filter those proposals. So they had algorithm or kind of a computational approach called a holographic consensus. The idea was based around some form of like mechanism design, token staking. This was kind of early Web3 days, so there was a lot of techno optimism and thinking that the right algorithm and the right smart contracts, we can solve all these what are in fact very complex socio-technical problems. But yeah, there's this idea of staking basically, so that as proposals come in, people stake reputation on whether they think the proposal will be passed or not. And then this leads to effective signaling of allocating attention to proposals that are more contentious or controversial. People can focus their attention on those proposals and ignore the ones that are simpler. So it's a great idea in theory, but in practice, what happened was that yeah, it didn't really work the way they planned. First and foremost, just because the scale of the Genesis was not big enough to warrant that heavy machinery of game theory. There weren't so many proposals being proposed, so they didn't really need that. What it was missing was basically more tools for deliberation, discussion, like forums, community building operations that weren't even software related, but just having more time to build community. There were some interviews. There's a great paper we referenced in our paper, a kind of retrospective on DAOstack by Brecke, I think, the name of the researcher, and a few others. They noted that there was a lack of overarching mission with Genesis DAO. The whole point of that DAO was to use the tools that DAOstack was creating. They didn't really have a purpose besides like voting on proposals. And that hindered group cohesion. Yeah, just to, I guess, summarize that, it's a kind of early case and an example of how the over-financialization of attention in the governance of online communities can backfire. So it's like you're trying to solve it by adding more tokens and more layers of economics, and that isn't necessarily going to play out the way you think, even though they probably have good ideas that we could be using around staking and reputation and thinking about how to rank and sort proposals with computational mechanisms.
Yeah, you want to go to the next one? I think it's interesting, for instance, that I was at a DAO governance event recently where they were talking about prediction markets in very much a way that kind of mimicking what DAOstack was doing years ago, but now in much larger DAOs. So these ideas recur. A second case study is that of Gitcoin, which when it converted to a DAO, started out as a delegation system. So building on this idea of liquid democracy, you delegate your stake to a smaller number of people who are going to direct more attention toward governance questions and vote on your behalf. And you could move that delegation whenever you wanted. But even that they found to be inadequate because people like me, who were brought in as stewards, who people delegated votes to, still didn't have the context to really make decisions. The only vote I participated in was about pineapple pizza, just because I didn't feel like I ever had time to figure out what the heck these proposals were about and what was at stake. They ended up creating some more social structures. They created a stewards council that would make sure that the top delegates had space and time to really understand the issues at play in the DAO. And so they ended up replicating patterns like a board to create dense interpersonal networks. They also created a reputation system where you could monitor your stewards through cards that would monitor their voting behavior. So they found that they had to develop more infrastructures to manage the attention economies than they initially anticipated. Finally, we look at automation. We looked at an early experiment in automated DAO voting where you delegate your decision making not to a person, but to an agent who you've instructed ahead of time. The agent makes votes in the various DAOs based on inferences on the input you've given. It kind of moves the governance surface from actually making the votes directly to having to oversee this voting agent. It's unclear whether that ends up saving you time or resulting in decisions that you like. But there's a lot of interesting work right now going on around agent-based democracy, both in contexts like DAOs, as well as, for instance, in efforts around citizen assemblies and other kinds of more in-person governance where people are exploring how can we use AI techniques to streamline attention economies, like summarizing discussions, so that if there are multiple simultaneous discussions going on in an assembly, how can you synthesize those? So this is very much, again, an active area of exploration, but we saw once again a case where the governance surface is being moved through automation. Let's see. Do you want to take on the observations and then move us into the heuristics?
Sure, that sounds good. I think I'm going to harken back to the earlier diagram to make the observations. Do you mind just putting the diagram with the case studies on it real quick? One thing that you'll notice about this is that in the Web3 use cases that we are exploring, there is a common base pattern where you have token holders, which are the parties with governance authority. The token is a representation of their right to participate in governance, regardless of whether that's financialized or non-transferable. You have a tokenized representation of governance authority and weight. But that still requires deliberative processes associated with like agenda setting and figuring out what proposals are going to be on the docket, establishing various rules about what is required to pass a proposal, and then the need for individual actors to then make sense of those proposals in context and to cast votes. And what we've seen in this governance overload context is that's a lot. And for reasons that people often participate in many of them, especially in the Web3 space, there was this governance overload and this constant need or desire or pain point to find a way to lighten that load. In each of these drawings, what is a mechanism by which that community attempted to change the shape of that governance surface, to introduce a intervention, as it were. In Gitcoin case study, it was a steward role that kind of bottlenecked in a more traditional human kind of scorecards and delegates way. In DAOstack, it was very algorithmic. It's a set of statistical protocols for determining the need for additional information. I think of that as an information theoretic intervention. And then you have a kind of modern AI sort of, hey, we've got these LLM agents, and if you load them up with enough context and give them enough instructions, they can make sense of all of that information for us. In my opinion, that hasn't been very effective for the reasons that Nathan alluded to, that people are not necessarily yet comfortable, qualified, or willing and able to expend the effort to then govern their agents. But in all of these, and this is the common observation, the intervention, it didn't actually eliminate the attention overload or eliminate a governance surface, it moved it. And so if you jump back to the observations list, I can round us out. We're seeing that the pain point emerged in a common way. We're seeing that there's a desire or a need for maybe aggregate level attention efficiency, in the sense that within a particular community, a certain amount of attention is available that has been volunteered, made available. And we need to find ways, at least in my opinion, to help communities and to empower communities to help themselves, to recognize, to take stock of their attention, both in its abundance and in its constraints, and make things work locally. So if you go to the next slide, the heuristics we've discussed are modes. This means being explicit about the modes through which governance is engaged with. And in some sense, this is making explicit the governance surface, the kinds of things that one can do that affect the steering of the organization, and our ability to be explicit about what they are, and our ability to give people guidance about how to participate in them. Processes relate to the kind of both organizational and technical. You could think of this as the bureaucratic component in some sense, rules, norms, and shared practices implemented to turn the attention into outcomes. In the Web3 world, this is often very technical, but in a non-Web3 setting, we see a lot of this is just like business process. It converts the effort that your communities, that your stakeholders put in, into actual outcomes effects. Information is the information that we provide to people in order to become informed. The field of information design is itself kind of emerging. It was particularly present in the Gitcoin case study, where the development of these dashboards and scorecards, which was information about the delegates, was an important feedback loop for selecting delegates. There's also information in terms of how we reflect an organization to its larger constituency, so people can decide when, where, and how to engage both as a participant and in governance. Incentives covers we talked about this as kind of return on intention, like what kinds of costs and benefits. That includes frictions, but also financial benefit perceptions that emerge within these contexts. I would separate this from processes in that processes are like strictly rules in the sense of you follow the rules, whereas incentives are like how you perceive the costs and benefits of what you put in and get out from modes of participation. And I think possibly most important is feedback. And it's really how this loops back around, because these aren't one-shot games. They're living systems made up of people, and attention is the lifeblood of those systems. And maybe that's me projecting my own pseudo-biological interpretation of organizations, but without a feedback process that gives rise to a continued injection of attention from the various stakeholders that make up a particular system, it becomes kind of a zombie. And since we're talking about a Web3 based empirical study, you can also look at other Web3 based systems where eventually the attention bled out, and those are the zombie DAOs. I think that we can move on from there. I want to make sure we get to discussion. Do you want to close this out, Nathan?
Sure. The main idea here is with these kinds of heuristics, we're trying to pose the question of how we think about attention in governance surfaces, and that we need to recognize attention as a critical aspect of design. If we're going to build more kinds of governance surfaces in our online lives, we need to be compassionate about how we design around attention and honest about what we expect, that we set expectations with our communities about what is appropriate attention, what kinds of governance inputs they involve. And we found that often there are disconnects. So how do we design around attention? We hope that these heuristics we've shared help people start to assess their own approaches to governance design with an eye toward attention, to recognize that unexpected behavior like lack of participation is a form of feedback about attention. We've often seen people blame their communities for what is actually a misdesigned attention economy. And then finally, to make sure that we expect governance design around attention to evolve, recognizing that attention economies change as the size and nature of an organization changes. I just love examples like this photo from one of the annual meetings that happens at the hundreds of rural electric cooperatives that function across the United States. People in communities co-own and co-govern their electrical grids. And at these meetings, I've been to them here in Colorado, they often have free food and games and fun. These are ways of building the attention economy for this governance. Yes, they're going to vote on the board members at that meeting, but they're also enjoying a meal together, a free buffet in this case. This to me is a small and simple example of how governance designs have been designing for attention all along. If you go to the next slide, we just have a link to the paper. Thank you all so much for your attention. Looking forward to what kinds of issues y'all want to bring up.
A quick shout out for Kelsey. She did her dissertation work, wrapping it up around when we were writing this paper. She covered like self-infrastructuring and this topic of like building and implementing these systems by and for communities. I found her contributions around the ethnographic component of these feedback loops to the final point around lived experience, redesign and recalibrating based on lived experience. That feedback loop heuristic is often implemented through human beings who are tracking, monitoring, writing, authoring, and sharing information to make organizations legible to themselves. And I think that's super important. And I wanted to give her an extra shout out since we didn't have her today.
Thank you all so much for that awesome presentation. If folks have questions, feel free to use the raise your hand feature or type your questions in the chat. Go for it, Jonathan.
Hi, this paper is great and really interesting. Did you look at questions about representative democracy as opposed to direct democracy? It's kind of my impression that's what led to the invention of representative democracy, was things were too big and too complicated for all the citizens of Athens to get together and figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, the closest we come to it looking at in these Web3 contexts is through this delegation mechanism. And I think it's interesting that in some respects, Web3 folks have been trying to get away from the representative logic, seeing, some of the ways in which representation can reproduce oligarchy. I think that is an aspiration in these kinds of communities. Yet at the same time, in the Gitcoin case, the delegation mechanism ends up in many ways reproducing a representative function. And so I think it's an example of this kind of meme of the idea that Web3 is speed running economic history, recreating a lot of the institutions that they're trying to get away from, and actually rediscovering the rationales for things like representation as actually an attention economic design.
Alex, feel free.
Hey, what's up, y'all? I was curious about what efforts were made to look at things through a Daniel Kahneman System 1 and System 2 thinking, knowing that your governance body can be split across different platforms. Like in cryptocurrency, you have crypto Twitter, Discord, and Discourse, and they operate at different speeds, especially looking at like your typical forum voting mechanisms and discourse, right? That's like a little bit more slower, a little bit more deliberative. And then the things that you see on like CT or in Discord tend to be really high paced. How much did you all look into that? And have you discovered any good mechanisms for bridging these two systems?
I can jump in. I think that the Kahneman style, like kind of individual psychological model of system one, system two, the kind of fast and reactive thinking and the more kind of slow, more deliberative thinking has a interpretation at a kind of collective group level, but it's not a perfect match because to your point, there's an even larger distribution of temporal modalities. You have very fast paced stuff, but that doesn't actually directly result in enacting something, but it is still salient. My intuition is that it would be prudent to do a temporal decomposition. I actually did some of that with work on Gitcoin many years ago around fraud detection, where we did temporal decomposition of the modalities of work required for a community to do fraud detection. For context, Kelsey and I were both involved in this. Before Gitcoin was a DAO, shortly after it became a DAO, we were helping develop the sub-DAO responsible for fraud detection. There was a decomposition of that sub-DAO around the different modalities of work, ranging from near real-time application of the models to their maintenance, to the development and education of the community that maintained those models. And what you'll see in any one of these settings is that there's like 3, 4, 5 different temporal modes that need to be attended to simultaneously. And I would flag that under a category of work to be done along the vector that we've highlighted here to understand attention economies and governance across temporal scales.
I think there's some interesting, I wrote some of it in the blog post that I linked in the chat. When you have interoperable systems, attention flows more naturally. So for example, you're talking about like Discord, all these social networks, right? LinkedIn. If these platforms are closed, it causes problematic dynamics with how attention flows because you have to look on LinkedIn to see what someone is saying. But in more interoperable worlds, for example, I'm pretty active now in the Blue Sky app proto community, and it's quite interesting to see how my activity in one app can actually be seen by other people in a different app. So you don't have this kind of fragmentation across apps, and that feels like a really important part of better information flows across apps.
Yeah, thank you all so much. This was such fascinating work. I was so happy to see the potluck buffet slide at the end. I think that like really brings it back to like the human side of the thing, not just like the technological solution. And mine's related. So I work in free software and work with a lot of free software communities. One problem we have is that people don't take the opportunity to participate. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about building the attention economy muscles for communities, specifically in digital spaces, so that we're shaping that governable surface to the particular community.
I think I would just go back to recognition that probably the answers are in our past, that it's kind of an old-fashioned thing. I think we imagine that with folk histories of things like Wikipedia and open source software, somebody just threw something on the internet and then everybody gathered and it magically happened, as opposed to people built organizations and seeded participation. And that's why I think the spaces like MetaGov and, for instance, Val was talking about playtesting events earlier as something that we're actively organizing. And I think, those matter. That kind of effort, like Val leads in building community in this space, really matters because participation doesn't happen magically. It has to be, to use a word from feminist economics, provisioned. You have to invest in creating spaces. Just like a corporation pays its board members, flies them out to fancy places, and feeds them fancy dinners. This is all part of investing in the practice of governance. We need to dispense with the magical thinking that people are just going to show up and participate, and instead recognize, okay, what do we need to do in order to invite people to participate? What do we need to do to make sure that it's worth their while to participate, that they understand that there's a value in it for them, whether it's through community or financial remuneration or something else? There are a lot of different ways to align to get those incentives right. It's a form of basic respect to recognize that people are not going to pitch into your thing just on their own, that one way or another, you're going to have to create something worthwhile for them.
I want to riff on the comments in the chat too about this regarding extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. It's a well-known phenomenon in behavioral economics that extrinsic mechanisms like financial penalties and fees have a tendency to overwrite rather than be additive with more social intrinsic motivation style things. And setting aside the Web3 stuff for a moment, in my own experience helping organize communities, again, food, parties, swag, they play really important roles in the incentivization structure, especially in places where, from a business level economic standpoint, it's actually impossible to make the dollars and cents add up. That a lot of the normative and social value created in community and through governance, enabling participatory governance, is not something that you can make add up, kind of hours-based financial remuneration, or assess on a basic capitalist economic return on investment model, but it can still be very real return on attention when you think about the other benefits. And that is, in my experience, created by, to make it concrete, like I was the board president of a nonprofit where we had an annual meeting. We needed to get people to governance, and our annual meeting was coupled with our big summer barbecue party. That was how you created the incentive to participate in governance. We would have a break to have the new people running for board or a general address, but it was a 45-minute carve out of what was otherwise 5 hours of hanging out in the city parks, grilling and socializing. And that was a major budget line item for the organization. And that wasn't there because we wanted to have a party. I mean, we wanted to have a party. It was a necessary component of the incentives required to meet quorum for our governance to take place. Without that party, we would not meet quorum.
I have a quick question on that. You said that extrinsic motivations overwrite, and maybe you said that they aren't additive. What did you mean when you said that they overwrite?
Imagine you have a setting where the original canonical reference was about people picking up their kids from daycare late. The social disincentive to pick up your kids late is very much present when they introduced like a system of finite fee. People perceived that as then having paid for the right to be late, and it actually increased rather than decreased the amount of lateness. Mechanism design like keeping track of who was late and broadcasting it amplified the normative incentive to not pick up your kids late rather than the financial fee, which gave people a sense that they had paid for the right to be late. And so that's a difference in mechanism design, completely flips the effect on the behavior.
I saw Florian had a question in chat. I wanted to see if you wanted to give voice to it, and then Malcolm next.
I'm not sure if I'm understood enough because I'm really new to the whole topic to ask that question. But earlier I was mentioning liquid democracy. Whenever there's too little participation, we need to focus more on the attention economy. I was thinking it sounded like platforms like Temu, which work with the psychological traits and weaknesses of people, would benefit from this approach. So I was wondering if you could clear my misunderstanding up.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Earlier, you were mentioning that there has to be food, or there has to be a party, or there has to be several kind of things which make people start participate in elections or whatever there is to participate in. And there was one comment on like if there's too few people to participate in an election or a liquid democratic election, like wouldn't that be an incentive for the people who organize this election to use all kinds of psychological traits to make them participate and things like that?
I think that in practice, governing organizations is really like muddling through. In my experience, most people, governance isn't something that they're really thinking about. It's a necessity. In the case of the example I gave about food and a party, part of that was just in the bylaws. We had quorum rules. We have to meet the quorum rules. We literally can't ratify a budget, elect new board members. Like, we can't do what we do, but people care about doing what we do, not governance as such. There's a special character of a space like MetaGov that's full of people who are really thinking hard about governance. But in the organizations I've been involved in, governance is not explicit. It's like it happens because it needs to happen because there are bylaws and rules about how the organization is comported, but like there isn't necessarily like a ongoing meta-analysis about the state of governance, if that makes sense.
I think that's really interesting case where that organization decided we're going to put in a poison pill to force through this quorum, force this participation and say this kind of participation matters. And I think what this paper asks is, where are you putting those designs in? Maybe the concern was, okay, the board is managing most governance, but we want to have at least one input a year where a large number of people step in. And I think that's a really important conscious decision. And I think in any organization, we should ask, what are the things that are appropriate to do at a smaller scale with a smaller number of people with focused attention? And then what are the things where more dispersed attention is important? Is it too much to ask for that quorum? Or is that a necessary kind of pain point to make sure that everybody in the organization feels that they're being called upon in some way? And every organization has to ask that differently. I don't participate actively in the governance of my credit union. Most people don't. But there are other communities where, like this social media cooperative I'm part of, I do like to participate more actively because it's rewarding in those intrinsic ways. These are questions we should be asking ourselves really intentionally, rather than what we hear. Why aren't people showing up? Why aren't people voting in every single DAO decision that we have? Like, don't you care about our DAO, when the level of expectations compared to the voice that people really have is just out of alignment?
And I invite everyone to pick 2 or 3 things in their life to really commit to being part of self-governance, but then let yourself off the hook for everything else. If everybody picks a few things and chooses to give attention to governance, it is very generative. Doing a good job in that is a lot of work.
It also requires aligning incentives to ensure that I did go to one of my credit union meetings. I have met with a board member, and I became satisfied through those interactions that this organization is set up to represent me, even though I'm not actively involved. And that's something we also have to design for. I think incentive alignment is an important tool, not the only tool. Mission alignment is also really important. But we have to be willing to trust those institutional designs.
The information design heuristic in our list is also potentially a key element of that. The incentives for you to feel confident that you're well represented and the lower cost of attention for you to come to that conclusion is part of designing the legibility, the information design part. I totally agree, and I think that's part of what the information heuristic represents in the paper.
Cool. So we only have 2 minutes left. We can squeeze one more question in, and Malcolm was next on the stack. So Rosa, if you don't mind, your question will be the first in our Slack follow-up discussion. So y'all should join the Slack and we can continue there. Malcolm asked, if we understand attention as both a response to Maslowian needs and a reaction to stress, then what ways could DAOs transform the attention economy, not just as a function of technology, but as a solution to the human needs themselves? Final thoughts on that from our.
That's a really big question to do in 1 minute.
Yeah, I have a thought on it. My participation in DAOs, like at the peak of the DAO boom, was really entertaining because I was able to join a team. There was this task board, and I had this incentive to earn tokens by like doing tasks on this board. And it was this distributed way of participating in governance, like bite-sized chunks of tasks that this organization made open to a wide group of people. I had never seen anything like that before. It was very formative in the way I think about, that DAO has since sunsetted. Like many, I think there was like this over financialization problem at the core of it, but it was very transformational in my understanding of what's possible when it comes to organizing people, getting people to participate in things, whether it be big governance decisions or just retweet something and earn a token. All organizations have things like that, ways of making participation more accessible, governance more accessible. But yeah, I had never seen that done in any way like that. That points to some potential avenues for growth, even though that DAO has sunset. Thank you all for joining. Please, everyone, if you take a second to just unmute, give our speakers a round of applause. Thank you all for joining, and hopefully see you at another seminar soon.